Of course, the individuals that are accessible and reachable by Ukraine's intelligence services or whoever else it is that is targeting, and let's not rule out that, of course, some part of the internal infighting within Russia's own elites could, in fact, be returning before long. All of them will be the ones that are most easily reached because there are plenty of targets, but it's a question of how you can actually get to them that will probably determine the sequence in which they are picked off. But yes, with any luck, people who have committed war crimes in Ukraine, who have joined in the planning of Russia's aggression against it, will be ever so slightly nervous now.
And more widely on this kind of hybrid warfare we've seen evolve during this conflict, do you think that is likely to slow down or decrease or stop even if some sort of ceasefire is reached in Ukraine?
Absolutely not. In fact, probably the opposite. One of the reasons why there was a temporary lull in Russia's attacks across the European continent was because all of its intelligence officers, those that had been thrown out of European countries after February 2022, were busy in Ukraine, conducting sabotage, murder behind the lines. And that's the reason why Russia had to recruit this network of proxies to do the work for them, because they could not use the original serving military officers that in the previous decade had been roaming Europe carrying out murder, assassination, sabotage, arson, etc. So if those people are released from what is happening in Ukraine at the moment, then we should expect actually not just not a lull, but a surge once again in those attacks across the European continent.
And so the possible movement towards some sort of agreement in the coming weeks, that shouldn't be read by European nations certainly as a sign that that they can relax at all, or they can be less worried about the threat from Russia.
No, even if there is an agreement impending, and I would suggest there are no signs that that is actually on the cards at all, it doesn't mean that Russia is going to stop its attacks. In fact, all of the previous patterns of behavior that we see suggest that at that point the brakes are off. The clock is ticking because Russia is rebuilding its armed forces and not having the Ukrainian armed forces destroying them almost as rapidly as they can be rebuilt. And they have the bandwidth, the resources, the personnel to actually carry the fight further into Europe.
And just coming back to that car bombing for a moment, I mean, what does it say about the Russian security system that these bombings can continue to happen right in the heart of the Russian capital?
I think it says more about Ukraine's reach and the capabilities of Ukraine's intelligence services. If it is in fact demonstrated that this is once again a Ukrainian operation, it speaks to the capability and the resourcefulness and the inventiveness of those people that are seeking to strike for on behalf of Ukraine.
So, what sort of action should we be hoping for come Monday from the US or from other allies of Kiev?
I don't think we should necessarily be hoping for anything at all from the United States. As I said, they'll probably be back on track very rapidly now. What is going to be interesting is what exactly is meant when they talk about walking away from the process, walking away from the undertaking that they've engaged in terms of trying to force Russia's surrender terms onto Ukraine. We've heard that now, of course, reiterated today by Marco Rubio, saying that it's a make or break week and eventually the United States will step away. But what that means is critical. If it just means that they're no longer going to try to back up Russia and try to force Ukraine to do what Russia wants and make all of these concessions in terms of territory, in terms of Ukraine's future viability, then that's not such a bad thing because we go back to the situation we were in before, where Ukraine is fighting without this threat of additional US demands hanging over it. If, on the other hand, it means that the United States is going to walk away from supporting Ukraine altogether, then that's a far more serious matter. Not so much the cutoff to the military aid, because that is already dwindling, but the intelligence support, which has previously been shown to be so important to Ukraine that President Zelensky was willing to encourage the White House to think that it could push ahead with the ceasefire plan that previously was thought disastrous for Ukraine because of the impact of the cutoff into that intelligence support. Now, between those two things, there's a huge range of different things that could be meant by the United States stepping away from the process. If, of course, the United States means that. And once again, we shouldn't necessarily confuse what is being said by the Trump inner circle by with what is actually going to happen.
Well, in the Kremlin, they have now said they're open to this idea of unconditional talks. I mean, is that a sign they've heeded Trump's words, or is it also just more delaying tactics like those you've described before?
Very hard to say. The delaying tactics, of course, have been unnecessary for as long as the United States has proven itself perfectly willing to just accept that Putin is going to ignore all of the supposed arrangements that the United States thought that they had arranged. If it does turn out that, in fact, now Putin needs to give some kind of indication that he's playing along, then that would explain the new language that we're hearing on direct talks with Zelensky. It could be something altogether unrelated. We simply can't tell until this plays out in real life.
And you've spoken about Russia. You know, they want to drag these negotiations out further. There maybe is something more they want to get, but what would that be? I mean, the deal they have seemed to that the US has put forward is that Russia will get to keep these regions. They may even get recognized by the US. There's no promise yet of real security guarantees for Ukraine. Certainly not from America. What is it more that Putin is holding out for?
Well, Putin may not necessarily know what else is going to be offered up as a gift by the United States, but let's look at the trajectory. For the longer that Putin has been stalling, the more the United States has pandered to what Russia wants. So if that trend continues, of course, more might be put on the table by the US, which again is a direct challenge to Ukraine's future viability as a state, but is a win for Russia. So it makes sense for the Kremlin at the moment to be stringing this process out for as long as possible.
And we talked before about that assessment that Russia will be making about how far they can go with this. Um, you know, they're not worried at all then about 100 days coming up, or any signs from the US that there could be a turn against Russia or more pressure put on.
I don't think anybody's taking the 100-day deadline particularly seriously. But of course, it's impossible to tell what is worrying the Kremlin and what is not. Now, we're told by ambassadors to Moscow, people who have taken the temperature in the Kremlin, people who are listening to what Russia is saying very closely, that despite all the evidence that Trump is bending over backwards to do what Russia wants, there's still a residual mistrust. There's still a residual concern that Trump might actually at some point turn against them. That will be informing these Russian assessments of how far they can go before they actually need to pretend that they are playing along with what Trump is offering.
And these US proposals for ending the war, currently Crimea is still at the center of that. Does a recognition by the US of Crimea as Russian mean anything, given that the annexation of Crimea is still judged as being illegal under international law, and it doesn't seem like anyone else is going to sign up to recognize Crimea as being Russian?
That problem is not just limited to Europe, it's actually global. Because that recognition that the United States is promising of Russia's right to Crimea, to territory that it has illegally seized, says to large aggressive countries around the world, if you attack your neighbors, if you invade them, if you seize territory, the United States is not only not going to intervene, but will actually facilitate this and will reward you by recognizing your right to that territory. And that is a hugely destabilizing thing to do around the world.
So, is there anything now that the US or other partners could do to stop nations? I mean, I think we're all probably thinking of China, for example, from seeing any agreement like this as just a tacit green light for land grabbing.
Well, they, of course, so much of the US turning away from Europe and its commitments to the European continent is supposed to be bound up with dealing with the China problem. But that pivot doesn't really seem to be reflected in US policy so much because there is very little that is being done to deter China and a great deal that is being done to weaken the United States' defenses against China, not only militarily, but also soft power with the erosion of the levers of soft power that the United States previously had, like the radio broadcasting stations, like USAID. All of that was important for withstanding Chinese influence. All of that is being demolished. So, what the United States is sending as a message around the world is that all bets are off. And yes, by all means, have a free for all and invade your neighbors.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.